Good morning, and welcome to the newest installment in ICCT's series of webinars on clean transportation policies in India. I'm Joe Schultz, Communications Director of the ICCT. I'm joined today, as before, by Gaurav Bansal and Anup Bandavadekar, our India program team. Well, today they will be reversing roles a little bit. Anup has presented the earlier webinars in this series, and today Gaurav Bansal will be our main presenter, and Anup will be playing the role of answering questions via the chat window during the presentation. Just a couple of housekeeping details, and then I will turn the microphone over to Gaurav. I apologize in advance to those of you who have been to others of these webinars and are hearing this for the second or third or fourth time. But very briefly, right now everyone in attendance is muted. That's so that we can preserve the audio quality of the presentation over the internet. We will intend to run through the presentation in full without any interruptions. But if you have any questions during the presentation, if you want need a point clarified or whatever, feel free to use the chat window in your control panel, and Anup Bandavadekar will be monitoring that and can answer some things very quickly during the discussion and can queue some others up later for the discussion following. After the presentation, we'll open the floor to discussion. We ask that if you have a question then and you'd like to pose it using the audio, just use the little raised hand icon in the control panel to indicate that you have a question, and we'll be monitoring that as well and can unmute you so that you can ask your question. And that's about it. We're recording this webinar and we'll be posting it on the website tomorrow. And I guess I should mention one other thing. This is a little bit different time than we've done these in the past. It's early in the morning in India. It's getting pretty late at night here on the East Coast of the United States. So we'd be happy to have your feedback on, especially for those of you who have attended several of these, what's the most convenient time? It's always difficult trying to manage different time zones. But anyway, so without further ado, let me turn this over to Gaurav.
Thanks, Joe. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. I'm Gaurav Bansal, and along with Anup Bandavadekar, we'll be talking about the costs and benefits of cleaner fuels and vehicles in India. And let me just say that there's actually a briefing paper we posted on our website today that has all the information in this presentation, in a paper form that can also be accessed. And I'll talk more about that at the end. So let me just first introduce the point to today's webinar and really what we've been doing in the ICCT regarding India. So this webinar is part of a greater study we've been doing on India's vehicle emission control program. And that's been looking at new vehicle and engine emission standards. That's also been looking at fuel quality standards. That's been looking at compliance and enforcement for both vehicles and fuels. We've also analyzed alternative fuels, so fuels apart from diesel and gasoline for vehicles in India. And these have all related to conventional pollutants, but we've also looked at the fuel efficiency side and reducing greenhouse gas emissions in India. So this webinar is the last of a series of webinars we've done on all these issues. And that link that you see at the bottom of the screen is a link towards all these other webinars that we've done, as well as other papers and blog posts and information on these issues. So today's webinar will focus on the costs and benefits of vehicular emissions and fuel quality. So we'll break it down into several different components. First, we'll talk about the cost of clean vehicles. And this is specifically going from Euro 3 to Euro 6, or in India, Bharat 3 to Bharat 6, which is the equivalent of Euro standards. And then we'll talk about the cost of clean fuels. And in this aspect, we'll really talk about low sulfur fuel production and the increased costs to do that. Then we'll transition to the benefits side, and we'll talk about specifically the health benefits. And within the health benefits, we'll talk about specifically reduced premature mortality due to lower vehicular PM 2.5 emissions. And then we'll just tie it all in together, and we'll discuss the costs and benefits, and we'll monetize everything. So jumping into it, let's talk about the clean vehicle costs now. So first of all, let's talk about what is possible in India in the future. So most of India today is at the Bharat 3 or the Euro 3 standard, and there are about 20 cities at the Bharat 4 standard. This is for four-wheel vehicles, so light-duty vehicles and heavy-duty vehicles. For two and three-wheelers, the entire country is at Bharat 3 standards. So what you're seeing here for both light-duty vehicles and HDVs, heavy-duty vehicles, is that for particulate matter and for NOx, the reduction potential is quite significant. Really ranges from about 60% at the minimum, but all the way up to 90% reduction per vehicle over current standards. And these standards are well established. This is because India follows the European pattern, and Europe either has implemented Euro 6 for most vehicles or is in the process of doing so. And so if India were to move up to Bharat 6, it would likely follow suit, and we would see a similar reduction in emissions. And apart from particulate matter and NOx for HCs, hydrocarbons, and carbon monoxide, there would also be a significant reduction. For two and three wheelers, the story is slightly different in that India has its own India drive cycle test, which it uses to test emissions from these vehicles. And based on that test, it sets vehicles emission standards separately. So in this case, it doesn't follow the European standard. Nevertheless, India is in the process of implementing GTR2, which uses the world harmonized test cycle for two and three wheelers. And based on a previous assessment in a previous webinar that we did, that Mr. Iyer conducted actually, who's an expert on two and three wheelers in India, there's really a 50% reduction in various pollutants from two and three wheelers in India as well. So now let's kind of talk about the costs of these. So of course, for each of these reductions, you're going to have to implement new technologies, whether they're after treatment systems or engine modifications or whatever they may be. So the report you're seeing here is a report we released earlier this year, and it looks at light-duty vehicle costs specifically to go all the way along the Euro path and also for the US. For India, these costs are, for the European costs are quite relevant because India does follow the European pattern. But what's important to know is that in India, the costs will likely be lower than what's been reported for Europe, mainly because vehicles there tend to be smaller. And this slide here, it's kind of a lot of numbers. It's there for your reference. These are the average engine size of various Indian vehicles we use in our analysis. The European numbers aren't shown, but it's important to know that these are generally smaller than what the averages are in Europe. So looking at the costs themselves, here you see four-wheeler upgrade costs. So this is light-duty vehicles as well as HDVs, heavy-duty vehicles. And what you're seeing is Bharat 3 on the left is your baseline. So that's assumed to be a zero cost because that's what you currently have in India. And then as you progress through Bharat 4, 5, and 6, you see that the costs slightly go up, or in certain cases go up significantly. So what's important to see in this graph is that gasoline cars are surprisingly cheap, or maybe not surprisingly. The reasons for that is that the reductions that gasoline cars require versus what diesel cars in India currently require are not as significant. Diesel cars are currently allowed to emit quite a bit more than gasoline cars, so bringing them down to lower emissions and progressing through the emission standards will take more money and will require more technology as well. For heavy-duty vehicles, which you see the diesel truck and the CNG truck at the top, those costs are of course much higher than cars. This is partly because diesel vehicles are bigger, but it's also because they're fundamentally different types of vehicles, and so they'll require different technologies. But even there, you see that CNG is relatively cheaper to upgrade than diesel. For two and three wheelers, it's much of the same story, that if you have a small motorcycle or a CNG auto rickshaw, your costs are much smaller than if you have a diesel auto rickshaw or a larger motorcycle. And then just keep in mind here that the y-axis here goes up to $250, whereas up here on the four-wheeler upgrade cost, your y-axis goes to $5,000. So really, if you were to superimpose the two and three-wheeler upgrade costs on the previous chart you saw, they would still be at the bottom. And to just summarize the costs and numbers here, this is going from Bharat 3 all the way to Bharat 6. And you see, particularly right there in the middle, gasoline cars would only cost $80, which comparing it to the overall cost of a car is relatively insignificant. Whereas for a diesel car, your costs are much higher, well over $1,000. So this kind of transitions now into fuels. So as I mentioned, most of India is at Bharat 3 in terms of both fuel standards and vehicle emission standards. But there are about 20 cities, the cities you see starred here, which have Bharat 4 standards. So they already have significantly lower emission standards per vehicle and as well as cleaner fuels. So Bharat 4 fuels in this case means that they have fuel with a sulfur content of no more than 50 parts per million, whereas the rest of the country has 350 parts per million diesel and 150 parts per million gasoline, sulfur gasoline. And the red dots you're seeing are the refineries in India that currently exist. And India is actually a country where refining capacity is expanding, and there are a number of new refineries that are expected to come on board in the coming years. So in the coming years, this map would likely change in that respect. And similarly, in terms of Bharat 4 cities, the plan currently is to expand to about 63 cities by 2015. So the cities you're seeing on here are the current ones that have Bharat 4, but this number would also go up in the future. Now to produce ultra-low sulfur fuels, and let me just define ultra-low sulfur fuels as fuels that have 10 parts per million sulfur content or less. So we talked about this a lot in our last webinar for those of you who are here for that, but let me just go through some of it again. So two important technologies that are needed to produce ultra-low sulfur fuels at refineries are hydrocracking and hydrotreating. And I won't get into the details of what each technology does, but those, let me just say, those are two of the biggest technologies that are used. In India, the most important technology that will likely be implemented for the production of ultra-low sulfur fuels is hydrotreating, which is the second one you see there. That's not to say that hydrocracking may not be opted for other reasons, but just based on our analysis or on consultant analysis we had on what is the most cost-effective way of producing ultra-low sulfur fuels, hydrotreating will be the most important. Apart from hydrotreating and hydrocracking, you will have to restore other aspects of fuel quality to maintain that the fuel meets standards. So for example, gasoline will have to maintain its octane number. Lubricity additives might be needed to maintain fuel lubricity, and you'll have some production losses due to hydrotreating or hydrocracking, which will need to be made up for. And again, a lot of that analysis can be seen in this report that you're seeing here. This is a consultant report written for the ICCT by Hart Consulting and MathPro, both of which are experts in the field of refinery analysis and oil production. And this report is done for 4 countries, actually, for India, China, Mexico, and Brazil. And a transition that was analyzed in this report was expected to happen by the year 2015. And it looks at both investments that are needed to produce ultra-low sulfur fuels, as well as the annual increases in production costs to maintain that production. And the full report is, again, available on our website. So talking about the report and the study in general, let me mention a few assumptions. So one is that ultra-low sulfur fuels will be used for almost all gasoline and diesel applications in India. So this is not looking expressly at on-road diesel or on-road gasoline. It's looking at all applications of it. Upgrades that were analyzed in the study were for technologies that are already in commerce. So if there are any emergent technologies, these were not looked at. The crude sourcing pattern would be the same in 2015 as it was in 2010. So this means that India will not be switching to low sulfur fuel crude just to produce low sulfur fuel. Now we've heard that India may indeed be switching to high sulfur fuels or high sulfur crude because that's cheaper. So in that case, the cost that you're about to see might be a little higher, but at the same time, the oil industry would save money in that it would be purchasing crude that is cheaper. And the last key assumption is that new refineries that are being built will not be built expressly to produce ultra-low sulfur fuels. So the assumption here is that they may have some new technologies that will assist in the production of low sulfur fuels, but they're not built expressly to do so. The reason they're being built is because the demand for fuel in India is increasing. And again, so the study looks at both operations costs as well as investments. So operations costs include the additional hydrogen supply you'll need for hydrotreating or hydrocracking, the cost of replacing lost product yield because you'll have some losses in these extra processes, and the additional cost of maintaining other aspects of fuel quality, for example, gasoline octane number. Investments then are going to look at initial investments you're going to have to make to to produce or to create or to install new units that will then produce ultra-low sulfur fuels. And what we've done, or what the study has done, is it has annualized investments. So using annual capital charge ratios, which are based on a number of investment parameters, and then these can be summed up along with operational costs. So to just look at the investment side, first of all, the study estimates that about $4.1 billion will be needed to invest, will be needed in terms of investments to produce ultra-low sulfur fuels in India. And of that, about $1.9 billion will be needed to go from current standards down to Bharat 4 standards, which are 50 parts per million sulfur content. And an extra $2.26 billion will then be needed to take the sulfur content from 50 parts per million down to 10 parts per million. Now, $4.1 billion is not an insignificant sum, but if we put that into context, we see that it's not really as far-fetched as it may seem. First of all, the 12th five-year plan, which is about to come out and will go from 2013 through 2017, expects a refinery investment of about $31 billion. And much of that will already be invested towards producing Bharat 4 fuels, because the number of cities with Bharat 4 fuels is being expanded. And separately, there are also a number of private refineries in India which will also make investments towards low sulfur fuels and ultra low sulfur fuels. So the 12th five-year plan, which is for the public sector refineries, that doesn't include investments that the private sector would make. Now, looking at fuel prices on a per liter cost, and this again takes into account both the investments that have been annualized and compared with projections in fuel production in India in the future, and it combines those with increased operational costs. So in current refineries, these are the refineries you saw on the map earlier. The cost would really be about 1 cent per liter, you can say, or about half a rupee per liter. In transition year refineries, these are refineries that are set to come online in the next couple of years. The cost will be even lower because they will have technologies already installed in them to produce ultra low sulfur fuels. And so really the cost that consumers can expect would be really around 0.7 cents per liter, or in rupees about 35 paise to 45 paise per liter. Sums up a lot of the costs, and we'll come back to that when we talk about cost-benefit analysis. But now let's talk a little bit about what the benefits are of all this investment and all this work. So the primary benefit, the one we've really studied, is the health effects side. And this has been studied in a number of countries, not just in India, but we've taken a subset of that based on World Health Organization work. And we've looked at the effect of PM2.5, which is fine particulate matter. And we've looked at the effects of that specifically on premature mortality in India. And just to mention that those are an important aspect of the benefits, but there are also other benefits of reduced pollution which we haven't analyzed. Some of those include global warming, which is affected by a lot of the pollutants you see listed there, and also adverse effects on agricultural yields, which in India, which is a country in which agriculture is very important, could be pretty significant. But again, we haven't looked at that, and we focused specifically on the health in our studies. So to compare what's possible, we created two scenarios. So one that you see at the top there is the BAU, which is the business as usual or baseline scenario. So this assumes that the current standards and current trends that are in place in India are not changed in the future. So for example, your emission standards and your fuel quality standards remain at Bharat 4 in a number of cities, but Bharat 3 in the rest of the country. Your enforcement and compliance, which means your number of vehicles on the roads that are gross emitters, remains at about 15%. And similarly, you see a continuing trend of dieselization due to government subsidies for diesel that incentivize the purchase of diesel cars. Alternately, we created the alternate scenario, and this scenario is one that we've chosen to analyze here in this presentation, but really in our larger study of what's possible in India and future standards, we've looked at a number of different scenarios. The alternate scenario you're seeing here is one that's fairly ambitious, but it's one that India, if it was serious about tackling vehicle emissions and reducing air pollution, that is definitely feasible. And so this scenario looks at possible move towards Bharat 5, Bharat 6, and beyond for vehicle standards as well as for fuel standards. It also assumes that compliance and enforcement will become more stringent, so therefore the number of gross emitters you have on the road will go down. And at the same time, it envisions a switch away from diesel and even away from gasoline to some extent towards alternative fuels, specifically CNG and LPG. So again, at the effect of these new policies on annual PM emissions, you see that the brown line there, or the brown field there, is what would happen under the BAU scenario, that emissions would continue to rise because there wouldn't be a reduction in emissions per vehicle, and with vehicle sales increasing in large numbers in India, your PM emissions would expect to go up. At the same time, the alternate scenario would reduce PM emissions even with extra sales, because you'd have higher standards, and you'd have increased enforcement and compliance to reduce the number of gross emitters on the road. And in the year 2020, you can expect about a 70% decrease in emissions if these policies are implemented. And if in years beyond 2020, you could expect an even greater reduction in emissions. So all this, of course, has an effect on public health. And again, that's what we've studied, and that's what we focused on. So let me just talk a little bit about our health modeling. So one is that it's been based on World Health Organization methods. So these are well-established methods, well-established equations. It's not something that's only India-specific, but is applicable to India and other regions of the world. We've based these reductions primarily on PM 2.5. So the chart you just saw before this was for all PM, or PM10, and we assumed that PM 2.5 to PM10 ratio would be about 76%. This is based on our own analysis as well as some analysis from the EPA. We did our study for cities. Cities were defined as cities that had a population of 100,000 or greater in the year 2000. We converted emissions into concentrations using an intake fraction method. In the field of emissions modeling and air quality modeling, this is a relatively new method. At the same time, it's one that's growing in acceptance and is simpler often than using a dispersion model. At the same time, we've also looked at 3 particular endpoints for premature mortality. One is adult cardiopulmonary disease, which is for adults over the age of 30. Another is adult lung cancer, which is also for adults over 30. And lastly, for child respiratory infections, which is for children under the ages of 6. And this last one hasn't been based on PM 2.5, but instead it's been based on PM10, or all PM. Let me just say again, to talk again about co-benefits and other aspects that we did not analyze. So our estimates are really somewhat of an underestimate of what's truly the potential of reduced emissions in India. So first of all, we apportioned our nationwide emissions that you saw in the chart earlier to cities based on their population share of the national population. We did this because we didn't have a better way of apportioning emissions to cities, although this is likely an underestimate of the true number of cars in big cities. So that reduces, again, your benefits estimate. Similarly, we did not look at morbidity impacts. So if someone falls sick, but they don't die from air pollution, that is not something we analyzed. No pollutants other than PM 2.5, or in the case of child respiratory diseases, PM10. None of these pollutants were analyzed, so NOx and hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide also have adverse effects on health and other aspects, but we did not look at those. There was no assessment of benefits in rural areas. Neither was there any assessment of co-benefits. Climate change, for instance, or agricultural yields were not analyzed. Nevertheless, even with our limited analysis, you can see that there is quite a bit that's possible from what we envision. So by the year 2030, over 535,000 lives cumulatively can be avoided, or sorry, premature deaths can be avoided just from adopting the policies envisioned in the alternate scenario. And you see that the number of lives saved each year is going up, and this is because the emission standards are getting tighter, and also as you have cleaner vehicles on the road that are replacing dirtier older vehicles, your air quality gets better and lives are saved. So now let's talk a little bit about the monetization of that. So with costs, we had the cost of producing cleaner fuels. We also had the cost of producing cleaner cars. But with health benefits, we had to come up with a way or develop a way to monetize the benefits of that. So what we did was look at VSL, which is the value of statistical life. And this is a method of monetizing health benefits, specifically mortality reduction benefits that policymakers use around the world. And so we based our VSL for India on a study done in 2006 that looked at jobs and the amount people were paid for different risks and jobs. And we found that the value, or the study really found that the value of statistical life in India is about $1.55 million for the year 2006. We modified this value for each year based on changes in GNI at purchasing power parity. Now that compares, just for comparison, to the US, the value for 2006 that's being used by US policymakers is about 7.4 million. So not surprisingly, the value in India would be less just because it is economically less developed than the US. Another aspect of our monetization is that we introduced a mortality lag to monetize benefits. And this is because we don't expect the benefits of reduced emissions to happen immediately after those emissions are reduced, but rather we expect those to come in the coming years. So what we did was we assumed 30% of the benefits would happen in year one being the year of the reductions, 50% would happen in years 2 through 5, and 20% would happen in years 6 through 20 after the reduction in emissions. So this chart here sort of sums up what we've been talking about throughout the presentation. So what you see there in the brown line are the costs. So the costs are per vehicle costs multiplied by expected sales in India through the year 2030, and those are added to the production costs for ultra-low sulfur fuels, as well as increased operating costs for that production. And so the per liter costs you saw earlier are multiplied by expected production for fuel in India through the year 2030. And benefits you see here in the blue line, these are the VSL values that we saw multiplied by mortality lags for the benefits that you saw in the avoided deaths that are possible under the alternate scenario. So what's really the takeaway here is that your costs initially are higher than your benefits. That's no doubt that you're going to have to make investments. But really about 5 years after you make initial investments and you change your policies, your benefits take over your costs. And from then on, your benefits far exceed your costs. So one of the reasons benefits continue to go up is that you have continued reduction in premature mortality as your air gets cleaner. At the same time, your costs are stable, or they really come down because of economies of scale, and because both car companies and oil companies have the experience of producing vehicles and oils for cheaper. And just to sum it up in terms of numbers, you see that, let me just talk about the bottom row there, which says cumulative to 2030. You see that your total vehicle cost would be about $170 billion. Your total fuel costs would be about $18.7 billion, but your benefits would range about $900 billion to leave you with a net benefit of over $700 billion and a benefits to cost ratio of almost 5. So that really sums up the presentation, and let me just finish by mentioning a few conclusions, and then we'll talk a little bit about policy, and then I'll open up the floor for discussion. So some conclusions, again, the benefits you saw will continue well beyond the year 2030. We did our analysis for the year through the year 2030 because we wanted to pick a reasonable time frame, but at the same time, your benefits for cleaner air would continue beyond that year. Again, the cost that you saw would decrease largely because of economies of scale and learning, whereas your benefits would continue to increase. And another aspect is that the co-benefits, which we did not analyze, would also be significant and would be added to the benefits. So what does all this mean for policy? Well, this kind of talks about what we've talked about in other webinars, in that really India needs a new auto fuel policy which looks long-term, particularly through 2025 or maybe even beyond that. And during this time, it should move to Euro 6 or Pilot 6 equivalent standards as soon as possible, and move beyond that if need be to catch up to international best practices. Along with new standards, India also needs to focus on in-use compliance and in-use enforcement so that vehicles are emitting what they're supposed to emit throughout their lifetime. Currently, there isn't a national in-use compliance program that reflects this, and from our modeling and from our studies, this would have a significant impact on the reduction in emissions. And lastly, one of the keys to all this work, or all these policies, is to enable ultra-low sulfur fuel production in the country nationwide as soon as possible. And this is because many clean vehicle technologies require ultra-low sulfur fuel to function correctly, and without it, you can't move to higher emission standards. And at the same time, the government must allow oil companies to recover this cost. And as we saw earlier, the costs are really they're under half a rupee per liter, and with gasoline costs hovering around 50 rupees per liter, and diesel costs hovering around 50 rupees per liter, and gasoline costs hovering around 70 rupees per liter, an increase of half a rupee per liter will not be that significant. And this is something the government can do almost immediately and allow oil companies to recover the costs now, and therefore they would have the money to make the investments needed in the near future to produce ultra-low sulfur fuels. So let me just close and say thank you and open up the floor for discussion. There's a lot more information on our website that's available, and you can also email me, gaurav@icct.org, or Anup Bandhavekar for more information. So thanks, and let me just open up the floor now.
Thanks, Gaurav. For the audience, if you have a question, you can just click on, there's a little hand button that allows you to raise your hand, if you will, if you have a question. And as you raise the hand, I will unmute you so you can actually ask your question in person. You might also be able to just type in your question in the question pane, and we can sort of address that if the mic's not really working at your end. There are just a couple of small questions that came while the webinar was going on, and I've posted brief responses to those in the chat window, which you can take a look at. One of the sort of issues that's it's been debated for the last couple of years in India with respect to sort of having a differential taxation of diesel and gasoline cars. And it sort of keeps coming back every year. And once again, it's a prospect of that has been raised by a proposal that Dr. Kirit Parikh has made. But right now, let me wait to go to that and take up the questions as they have come. And the first question I actually have in writing from Gauri Shankar Mishra is with respect to estimates of the volume of non-tailpipe transportation-related PM emissions as a percentage of the tailpipe PM emissions. And I'm just going to unmute Gauri and see if Gauri wants to actually talk about that a little bit. Hi, Gauri. Would you like to ask your question? Hi, Gauri. Can you go ahead? But anyway, in the meanwhile, I'll take a question from George Price. George, go ahead. George, can you ask your question? Looks like we are having difficulty with people's microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yes. Thank you for your presentation, Gaurav. I've got in late, but I'm looking forward to seeing the summary notes as they come out, as they're issued. Mm-hmm. And thank you, Anup, again for all of your support on these presentations. I was curious, have you addressed, has the private sector been included in your studies? And now in private sector, I'm talking about the auto and the trucking industry as a whole. You know, the fleets and all of the users of the fuel. Have you dealt with them at all, or is it primarily just policy that you're focusing
on? As far as interactions with all of these go, we routinely do interact with all the different stakeholders. Our analysis itself is focused on on-road vehicles, that is cars and trucks and buses and 2- and 3-wheelers. Okay. We haven't really included agricultural tractors or heavy construction machinery, all of which would actually benefit from tighter emission standards and cleaner fuels, and those have not been included in our analysis.
Okay, and the reason I mentioned individuals, you know, the users, is you know, I wanted to find out if indeed you had queried if they are are they being receptive to change within this this area? Are they interested in change, and are they looking for solutions themselves? And now I'm referring to the manufacturers, the OEMs, you know, and are they? It would seem that they would be the primary drivers of some of this if indeed they were players.
So we actually have a couple of representatives from the manufacturers on this call, but let me just kind of say that the Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers actually held an event a couple of weeks ago in Delhi, where essentially SIAM has time and again now asked the government for preparing a roadmap on vehicle emission standards. Okay. In some ways, many automotive OEMs in India are producing 3 types of vehicles. They're producing a Euro 3 or a Bharat 3 car for sale in most of India. They're producing Euro 4 cars to sell in these 13 to 20 cities. And many of them are actually producing Euro 5 cars that they are exporting to Europe and other parts of the world. And it's in some ways it's quite ridiculous to be doing that, but that's the reality that we have in India.
I see. Okay, thank you for that. And just one more thing is, do these parties talk to each other? You know, we found in the U.S. that there was a very little common ground that for the discussion to take place between the regulatory agencies locally, you know, our regional air districts and the OEMs and then the fleets. You know, there was very little common ground for them to be in discussion. It was amazing to find that to be the case. Is that the same in India?
I mean, I cannot speak for a broad section. There are limited conversations that do take place, but you're quite right that this is kind of an issue that affects actually a pretty broad range of stakeholders. Yeah. And one of the things that you have to understand in the Indian context is that, and this goes to the broader institutional structures that we have not really discussed here, that in the US context, for example, in order to meet the Clean Air Act, the different states actually come up with a state implementation plan and very concrete actions that deal with those implementation plans. Many of them might be concerning with better compliance programs or retrofitments that have been taking place in the recent years, and so on and so forth. So while India has actually pretty good national ambient air quality standards, the feedback loop that forces states and local authorities to achieve those local ambient air quality standards is missing. And that's been one of the institutional problems in the Indian context, that while there are ambient air quality standards set nationally, the driver to do those locally are missing.
I see. Well, it seems like ICCT should be in an excellent position for putting out recommendations to help with that. Because I would imagine the states, the individual states would want to comply, or would want to at least show that they're willing to comply with.
And certainly local air quality problems do become major issues from time to time. Most recently in Delhi, where there was a period of essentially 15 days of PM10 levels being literally in the hundreds of micrograms per cubic meter for a period of days. Wow. And while not all of it is, of course, related to transportation, quite a bit of it is the problem is exacerbated due to transportation emissions. Sure. But thanks, George.
Okay, thank you very much.
A couple of questions came on to the question pane. One of them is from Priyanka Kukareti, and the question is, are commercial vehicles and two-wheelers also covered under emission standard norms? And of course, Gaurav could go back to the previous slide, but the brief answer is yes, that the emission norms at present apply to all of these different categories of vehicles, as well as those that we did not include, like the tractors or construction machinery. While one of the problems that we have, in fact, I would say the most significant problem right now in India is due to this dual fuel scheme, where most of the country is on a 350 parts per million diesel level. All the trucks that are sold in the country, the heavy-duty trucks, are actually at Euro 3 level and not at Euro 4 level in the major cities, where you find only a small fraction of buses and light commercial vehicles that are diesels that are at Euro 4. And that's a significant problem to begin with. And so until India can really bring these emission norms at the same level countrywide, this sort of dichotomy would persist, and most of the trucks, the heavy trucks, which are the largest source of PM emissions, would actually continue to have a lower emission standard. That problem does not exist, fortunately, for two-wheelers and three-wheelers, which the fuel quality is quite adequate, and the standards are actually nationally harmonized, and the same needs to happen for cars and trucks. There is an additional question from Ashish Nigam, and the question is with respect to blending of ethanol, that India has allowed for up to 5% blending of ethanol. And so I'm not as knowledgeable as I would like to be on this, but the situation briefly is as follows. That India has had a desire to blend up to 5% of fuel with ethanol, but for last several years, adequate supply of both sort of bioethanol or biodiesel has not really come through, in part really through because of pricing of these is really not that attractive in the Indian context, and in part because ethanol in India, most of which comes from sugarcane, is really competing with sugar prices. Now, there have been some recent announcements where the government, in an effort to stem some of the import bills of oils, is trying to lean on the oil companies to comply with this sort of a requirement to blend, but it might take a while before India goes there. Some of the ministers, in particular previous ministers of the environment, have been quite reluctant to push on biofuels because, quite understandingly, because of the food versus fuel issue, which is quite prevalent with respect to these fuel, and not to mention all the indirect land use issues that we struggle with. One question from Varun Jain, which is, how can we help you to take this message to the policymakers in India for a more informed discussion? And thanks, Varun. And from our side, we are trying to brief policymakers where we can on all of these issues. And this webinar series is a small way to broaden that base from some of the policymakers that we might talk to a more broader audience, and have, as you said, a more informed conversation. But we would be very happy to meet with other stakeholders or key policymakers that you want us to engage with, and we'd be quite glad to talk about these issues, provide more information or analysis as the need may be.
Let me just add to that, Varun, that all the information you're seeing on here on the slide, as well as these webinars, is on our website. It's available for download, and everybody's welcome to share this information with others, be they government officials or just others who are interested in this. So you're all free to use our material and spread the knowledge of all this content.
There was a question from Gauri Mishra, and I thought he would ask it in person, but it didn't seem like that. So the question was, do you have any estimates of the volume of non-tailpipe transportation-related PM emissions as a percentage of tailpipe PM emissions? And so we do have some estimates, and they are mostly from different source apportionment studies that have been conducted in India. And the range varies of how much transportation emissions contribute towards the total PM emissions. And broadly, the range, it goes anywhere between 20% on the lower side to as high as 40% in certain cities of the transportation source. Now, one of the things that ICCT is trying to do is really, we are not necessarily concerned only about a fraction of emissions, but really the health impacts from PM. And in particular, PM 2.5, which has not been monitored as closely in India until fairly recently. Not only that, is where that impact takes place. One of the reasons why transportation-related PM emissions are important is that these emissions happen near the roadways, and some of the work that Health Effects Institute has done suggests that in a city like Delhi, for example, more than 55% of the population lives within 500 meters of major expressways and 50 meters of major arterial roads, where they're exposed to vehicular pollution in large quantities. So one of the efforts that ICCT is trying to do right now is to estimate what we call transport attributable fraction of PM 2.5 health impacts. And that work also suggests something closer to a 30% roughly of the PM 2.5 health impacts are due to transportation, PM 2.5. So to put it in the context, the the baseline sort of rate of PM 2.5 related deaths was somewhere in the range of 150,000 PM 2.5 related deaths. If I've got it wrong, Gaurav, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's correct.
And so you can get about a 30% of those would be attributable to transportation-related PM 2.5. And so one publication that will come out probably sometime later in 2013 will be sort of an ICCT transportation health roadmap, which will get into some of these issues in detail. But I think there are reasons why we think transportation PM emissions are of particular concern because of the kind of emissions that come out of it. There's, of course, a question of whether this webinar will be available as an archive, and yes, it will be available as an archive on the website, as well as all the slides will be posted online. At this stage, I am not seeing any additional questions. One thing I would like to mention is that we've tried to do this webinar series, as I said, is more to just have an informed conversation about auto fuel policy issues in India. And all of these materials are available, and sometime in the March timeframe, we would release sort of a final report on this, and would really look forward to doing a broader public outreach on these issues in India. So do watch out for that, and we'll try and do a summary of policy recommendations as well as institutional recommendations at that time as well. So if there are no further questions, Gaurav, is there something you would like to add at this stage?
No, let me just say thanks to everybody again. And if you do have a question you think of later, you can always email me or Anoop, and we'll get back to you.
Great. Gaurav usually posts a little webinar notes, and based on some of your questions today, we'll do the same along with the presentation and webinar session. So thank you all, and we hope to see you at another one of these events at a later date.